Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's guest is Daniel Davis. He fought in the Gulf War in 1991, in the Iraq War in 2009, in the Afghanistan wars in 2005 and 2011. And in 2012, he put out an article about some of the failures of the Afghanistan war that got a lot of attention. And we're here to talk about, the Afghanistan, Iraq failures, some of the reasons behind this, and the correlations of these wars and the patterns that maybe come up to this day, and hope to provide some solutions and understand why it happens to prevent it in the future. And I'm really happy to have him on. How are you doing, Danny?
I'm doing really good. Thanks for having me.
So obviously I've given a brief background on yourself there, but if you just want to tell people who you are and a bit about your military career.
Yeah, I actually first joined as a private in 1985 and was basically serving with the U.S. Army in Europe, in part of the Cold War when it was still, fully engaged and all that. Then I got out later and got a degree and a commission, came back in with the 2nd U.S. Cavalry in 1989. I came back to Germany again, was with the 2nd ACR, Armored Cavalry Regiment, was on the east-west border patrolling actively between the two sides during the Cold War with, an actual live mission that could, if anything ever happened, if anybody came across the border, we were ready to go to war. In a moment, we were the first line of defense. Then in 1991, Saddam Hussein, I'm sorry, 1990, August 1990, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, which starts a series of events, which leads us to getting deployed into Saudi Arabia in late 1990, and then in February 1991, the big famous left hook from General Schwarzkopf in the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment was the tip of that spear, and of the 2nd ACR. Eagle Troop and 2nd Squadron was the tip of the tip. So we actually were right at the center and the heart of everything that happened. Ended up fighting the Battle of 7-3 Easting, the biggest tank battle that the U.S. had fought since Second World War. Then I served in various other units until and in 2002 I was in the Pentagon. Actually, just after 9/11, was there for all the preparation in the Army Operations Center, overseeing the 2003 invasion of Iraq. So I saw it from the strategic level first. And then in 2007, I ended up going as the second in command of an armored cav squadron myself in Germany for the 1st Armored Division. And then as you pointed out there, I've had a total of 4 combat deployments, 2 each in Afghanistan and Iraq, the last of which was in 2011, which preceded my article that you referred to there, which was covered extensively by the New York Times. They call me a whistleblower. I don't. I call myself just telling the truth and doing what you're supposed to do, and not letting people, especially leaders, both uniformed and civilian, get away with lying to the American people and to the global public about what's going on in those wars. And I felt a compulsion to do the right thing, regardless of what it may cost. That's kind of what I did with that. And I think the time since 2011 pretty much validated what I argued at the time. As it all played out to horrific end in 2021, in August 2021. And so then ever since then, I've been working for what's called the Defense Priorities Organization in Washington, D.C., which is a organization that's designed to advocate the strong national defense, but a restrained foreign policy, only using military force if we're attacked or if our country's attacked, which ironically is what the Constitution says. So we're just basically saying, forget about all this stuff about just using military force as a tool of statecraft, like a first choice instead of something of last choice. Because as someone who's fought in 4 different conflict zones, I despise war more than you can imagine, more than anybody else. And so I'm advocating for that, restraint and wisdom in the use of military force, because I'm not an anti-war person. I'm an advocate of a strong national defense to protect our country, but not to go on adventures. I think it's absolutely the wrong thing to do. That's the genesis of it.
Yeah, I mean, clearly reading from your bio, you've had extreme, a big military career, going from, just after during the Cold War, but then actually fighting in 1991, and then obviously to the 21st century with Afghanistan and Iraq, which have been, one of the biggest military ventures, the US has done in its history, but especially obviously in recent times. So, I just want to stick with Iraq for the start.
Okay.
By the time you entered Iraq in 2008, 2009, what were your feelings about the war? What had you been reading? Was you following the media, or, did you listen to other soldiers' accounts? And how did your experience in the Gulf War, maybe shape this view when you got there?
The 2009 deployment that I had and the 1990-91 deployment were as different as night and day, and there was really no correlation between those two at all, because one was high intensity tank on tank warfare, and the other one was kind of nation building and counterinsurgency at the time. And by the time I got there, that was after Petraeus' famous surge, and the casualty rates had just dramatically fallen by that time. And my actual job was to lead a team of American specialists to train an Iraqi border battalion on the border between Iraq and Iran, and to train them up in in the Western ways and all that. And so I guess the first experience that I have, or the first observation, is that when I got there, things were not what I expected. And I discovered something that would prove to be. I went over there as a cohort of, I want to say, like 30 or 40 additional small teams. It was about 8 men, 8 strong, or specific leaders in different categories that would be matching up with their counterparts in an Iraqi battalion, doing training, etc. And there was about, if I remember correctly, about 30 teams that I was part of. We all were trained together, and then we dispersed to the 4 winds once we got to Iraq. And at least at the end, when I talked to all the other team chiefs that I talked to, had almost an identical experience with mine, which is that the Iraqis did not want us there. They did not take the training seriously. They weren't interested in it. I remember after I got to know him, it took a while for the commander to kind of open up to me. But shortly before I left, he said, one day we came in and for our scheduled meeting and over tea, which the Iraqis always do, he said, listen, he said, he sent his aide out and closed the door. He spoke a little bit of English or enough English. And he said, listen, I'm ordered to host you here and to have your guys come and train us. You're ordered to be here to come and train us. And we were both doing what we're ordered to do. But the truth is we aren't really paying a lot of attention to this because we don't think we need it. We know how to be on the border. We've been here a long time before you guys got here, and we're going to be here after you left. So, let's just do the best we can and enjoy the team. And so that was kind of what I experienced there. And you could see, I mean, it was like as if you took a bunch of kids, college kids or whatever, you went on adventure training or, some of these soldier fit things where they're doing stuff that soldiers do. It was like that. You could see they were having a good time with it. They were playing, they were having fun, joking around with each other, but nobody was taking it seriously. And of course, then I was not in the least surprised when 4 or 5 years later, when ISIS broke out, that the army just disintegrated because they weren't taking it seriously. And of course, that was compounded by the fact that the Iraqi political leadership was just desperately corrupt. And Maliki at the time, who's the prime minister, was not even hardly trying to hide anything that, they were putting sycophants into the positions that people were getting brigade and division commands based on political affiliation, not on any kind of capabilities. And so when you may recall, or maybe you don't know, I don't know, the original disintegration of the Iraqi army started in June of 2014, when what was supposed to have been a small raid by about 1,000 ISIS guys into the city of Mosul, which was garrisoned by over 100,000 Iraqi, a couple of divisions, like armored division. I mean, large numbers of troops, tens of thousands. They were supposed to have done a raid and then escaped, but because the leaders of the Iraqi army were so bad and didn't know what to do, they actually, when even the skirmishes start, literally left and abandoned their men behind. And of course, once the leaders leave, well, the guys aren't going to stay behind and fight for somebody that they don't even know. So They literally just collapsed and took off their uniforms in many cases, threw down their weapons and ran. And then, of course, ISIS was only too happy to fill in those gaps and to keep chasing as these people went out there. Well, that didn't surprise me at all because all the stage had been set for that. And, and then that's buoyed against, as I would later write in 2012 of Afghanistan, just year after year of American political and military leaders coming before Congress, coming before the American military and the American media and saying things are going great. We're improving. The Iraqis are taking more and more control of their country. They are getting better. They're being well trained. And now then they're able to provide their own leadership. They're actually taking the lead on these offensive operations. All this stuff, which was nonsense. It was always nonsense. And I personally observed it, the portion when I was there. And then we all saw the results of it in 2014. And that was kind of the gist of what I saw during that particular time frame. And, it just had some terrible results.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it follows a very similar pattern with Afghanistan over the years, and obviously what happened in July 2021. So kind of like linking with my last question, how did your time in Afghanistan, when you go into Iraq, you've already had one deployment in Afghanistan. So did you kind of go in with some of the feelings and, maybe been told, Afghanistan, Iraq have a lot of correlations about the problems that's going on with, the domestic corruption, the Afghan army just not being equipped properly and all those sort of things. So how did your deployment in 2005 in Afghanistan? Afghanistan. Affect when you went to Iraq in 2008?
So my 2005 deployment to Afghanistan, my actual job was a liaison officer between what was called the Combined Forces Command Afghanistan and U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, that was headquartered in Qatar and Tampa. And so my job was a liaison officer between the two. So the majority of my time was spent in Kabul, Qatar, and in Tampa at CENTCOM headquarters. And then in these daily briefings, the twice daily briefings to the senior leadership of CENTCOM. And I was supposed to convey things back and forth between our headquarters in Kabul. So I didn't spend too much time on the ground in Afghanistan, but when I was there, especially in Kabul, it was amazing because one of the primary things we were doing is we were standing up police battalions and, in the domestic forces. That was just a handful of years after the Taliban had been eradicated, after Al-Qaeda had been decimated and just scattered to the four winds. At one point, they said there were probably as few as 50 in the entire country. And there was no Taliban. The organization had been wiped out, completely destroyed. And so during that time, there wasn't much organized resistance. I remember one of the times where I believe it was in early 2006, we went to inaugurate a new police battalion that was opening in Mazar-e Sharif. And that was up in the north. And we went up there and we drove from Kabul. We flew from Kabul, but then we took a pickup truck, just a regular truck, no Humvee, no armored, no nothing. And we drove through town. Nobody was wearing body armor, was wearing soft caps, not even, helmets. All I had was my personal sidearm by me because it was safe. It was no problem. And we didn't feel the slightest risk of anything. After the ceremony, I remember we went to the town bazaar. We're just walking through the stalls, just like we were tourists, not the slightest concern. We were actually invited to go into the famous Blue Mosque up in that area, and the imam actually allowed us to go at least through the outer walls into the inner courtyard, but not to their holy places, whatever. But they were willing to allow us to come in there, and it was no problem for that. Now, by the time I got back in 2010s, which is when I landed for the first time in there, the country had gone through a dramatic transformation. Now that you don't go outside the wire for anything unless you're fully kitted up, not even in an armored Hummer, but now in the MRAPs and those really strong armored vehicles, because the situation had deteriorated so dramatically. And that was, by the time I got there, it was at the height of the Petraeus surge. He did one in Iraq, and now here he is kind of in charge. At first, he was the CENTCOM commander, and then later the Afghan commander. And he had been telling, people over Congress. It started off with, you may remember, Stan McChrystal, General McChrystal, who said, we're going to go and we're going to get the inputs right because, my God, if we don't get more people, the Taliban could win. So we need another 40,000 people, to stem the tide. And we're going to have government in a box, and we're going to do all this stuff. And Marjad, all the media was all about covering that thing. And, the reports were that it was succeeding, that, that the Taliban was now on the run again. And then I saw all these headlines and congressional briefings by Petraeus and some of the other deputy secretaries of defense, et cetera, talking about how this was working, how what was the famous thing that the Petraeus, he said that we're on the right azimuth now. We have the inputs right. And the Taliban's momentum has been broken and in some places reversed, and, all these, bumper sticker kinds of things. And I remember I had actually written something in 2009 and 2010 in the Armed Forces Journal. And I said, look, if we don't make some major changes here, as far as I know, I was the first one that ever said this. I said, we will lose the war to the Taliban. And of course, at the time, that was absurd. They thought that there was no chance that they would ever defeat us. And yet, for the reasons that I cited, that was very much a real risk. And I've recommended some changes. Here's what we should do instead. And the main thing was withdraw and get the military out of there and transition to a different kind of operation. But we didn't. And so I didn't think that was a good idea. But now I hear all these reports that things are working. I see the media covering it. And so I thought, okay, I guess I was wrong. And if, things are moving in that direction, I'm glad to be sent over there as a soldier because I'd like to be part of seeing Afghanistan turn back into a safe country for its people so that the war would stop, that the Taliban would be defeated, and that people could finally live again in peace, because I wanted that more than anything, and I was happy to be a part of it. However, once I landed on the ground, I discovered that everything that we had been told was a lie. The Taliban's momentum was not checked. Things were not getting better. The Afghan military was not being better trained. I didn't see, I went on a number of missions with both American frontline troops and Afghan troops and a lot of joint patrols. And I remember thinking at the time, I'm like, these guys they're again, kind of like it's adventure training. I remember two in particular cases where one that we're on a joint patrol and the Afghan military guys were doing some weed right there not even trying to hide it, just doing some weed. And you could see them, with their whole eyes kind of glazed over. And I looked over at the American patrol guys who were on patrol with them, and they said, this is normal. This is like all the time. This is nothing unusual. This is just how they do. And so, okay. And then another time we went on in a different province. I believe it was in the Coast province. Or actually it was northern Kandahar, and it was a very hot day, like 116 degrees that day. And we were going to go on a foot patrol to set up a defensive position in a building complex that had been captured just the day before, and the Taliban driven out of it. And they were going to build up machine gun positions, whatever, so that they continued to try to move the Taliban out of that zone. And so it was a joint patrol. The Afghan forces go down there. They do the patrol. They get to the thing. They go to the shade and take a nap. Nobody did any work. They just said, yeah, the Americans will take care of it. Didn't even attempt to do anything. And of course, the American, at the tactical unit are very highly trained, very professional, disciplined force, and they did everything you're supposed to. They started building defensive positions, machine gun nests, all those kinds of things, all the priorities of work that you're supposed to do. And again, the leader just kind of rolled his eyes and said, this is just how it is. So it was evident even then. And then subsequently on that same tour, I would, in yet a different part, and this was in the Coast province, where they said, look, we have radio intercepts. The Afghan military that we're training are making deals with the Taliban. Okay, look, you don't go here, we won't go here. Nobody shoots anybody. Everything will be fine. Sometimes they'll both just shoot off some rounds in the air to make it look like that they're doing something. But basically, it was a no-go area. And so there was no doubt in my mind that nothing had changed in here, that everything that we've been told at the official level, whether that was in congressional testimony, in front of the media, or any other kind of way, was all nonsense. And yet you still saw year after year after year, even after this, where the military and the senior political leaders, they always said the same thing. Things are getting better, things are improving, et cetera, until it disintegrated physically in April, finally, of 2021. And there's, of course, a bunch of reasons for that. But, in this country, a lot of people love to say, well, that was because Joe Biden did a terrible job with the withdrawal. And look, I will be the first to specify a number of things that they did poorly that shouldn't have been done. But that's only because the rot of the previous 20 years made it there was no good way to do it. Getting out was the right answer. Let me just be clear on that. I supported the president and still do on that. It could have been done better, but it needed to be done. But the problem was the 20 years before that, where basically we just lied to everyone and said things are working when they weren't. And then this is the predictable result. I called it back in 2009. I called it virtually every year after that. It was self-evident that this was going to happen. So it didn't surprise me in the least. And yet, in very discouraging form, you had like David Petraeus, you had some of the other generals who were in charge of this disaster, who were the architects of the rot that I'm talking about, who were then the first ones that the media go to as an explanation for what happened in August of 2021. And of course, they're blaming everybody in the world but themselves. Petraeus famously said, man, we had the inputs right there and when I went into 2010 and 2011, and then they squandered. It's always somebody else's fault. But look, I called it at the time that what he was doing was nonsense, and it turned out exactly that way. But that's part of our problem now, is that we still listen to those people and we still give credibility to them because they have 4 stars on their collar at one point or on their shoulder boards. And now then, I mean, beyond the scope of your video here, but we're doing some of the same things in the Russia-Ukraine war, and our descriptions of it, our explanations of what's happening. And I just see the whole thing playing out all over again, and I think it's going to have the same predictable bad result.
Yeah, I mean, you can see David Petraeus again now on TV doing interviews about Ukraine and stuff. So, the same characters do come up time and time again. But just going back to what you're saying there. So, on the ground level, the commanders, the generals, are they in the know of this and it's not making up to the chain of command for people like Petraeus? Or are they fully aware of it? You said you could see it, so I can imagine the whole platoon, all the people there can see it. They know it's a dead end war, there's so much domestic corruption and it doesn't make it up to the chain of command. Or, why do these wars continue year after year? We're still obviously in Iraq and Afghanistan, 20 years. So what is the system that, continues?
Yeah. A couple of things were at play in the Afghanistan. I'll stick with the 2010-11 because that was the kind of the central part of it. You have one thing that's inherent in the American military personnel, and I'm talking about at the individual level and even at the unit level, which is a great feature, or it can be, which is that we will do any job we're given. If it's crazy, if it's an impossible task, we're not going to just say, oh, we can't do that. That's hard. No, we're going to say, okay, roger that, sir. We're going to do everything in our power to make that happen. And they will go and do the best they can. So let's just say any given brigade that would come down there. There was, I think, 15 brigade combat teams that were spread around the country at that time. So I would go into nearly all of them at one point or another, but there was virtually the same thing everywhere. That unit replaced somebody else when they got there. And so there was already something going on there. So this team comes in and the commander says, okay, our objectives are to improve the situation. There was rarely a militarily attainable mission like, capture this territory or destroy this much of the Taliban, because those were really hard to measure. So they wanted to make it better, improve governance, improve the training. It's something that's really hard to define. And so the commanders, I mean, they have to be there for 12 months, so they got to do something. So they will give tactically attainable tasks. And it's like, okay, we're going to conduct presence patrols. We're going to help with these money to build projects here, build schools. We're going to pave roads. We're going to, help girls get into schools. All these things that are good. And so the commander at the end of his 12 months will say, okay, we improved A, B, C, D, and E, and even F was a little bit better too. And then they'll hand that off after I left to the next battalion brigade that came in there. And so they'll start from scratch and they'll say, okay, all right, those things were done. Now I'm going to do GHIKL. So he'll have a different set of tasks, and he'll report up honestly that we improved all of these things, areas, these 5 areas here, we improved all of them. And so those go up the command. And so when they consolidate all these reports at like the division and higher, they're going, okay, man, every time we see there's something improving, it's going on. Got it. That's cool. And that's what they'll report. The higher you get up the chain of command, that's all anybody wants to hear about, because they want on their rating, they want to get from 1 star to 2 stars, 2 stars to 3 stars, etc. Everybody wants to get promoted, so they're going to say whatever they need to on the ground to make themselves look better. And to a degree, they can be honest about that, saying, yes, these 5 things were improved. But the other thing that I also observed, especially at the tactical level, is that those soldiers knew good and well that this strategic objective was nonsense, that we're going to turn this into any kind of a democracy, that the Afghan government is going to be effective and not corrupt, that the Afghan military was going to be capable and was going to be able to provide its own defense and security, because they could see that none of those things were going to happen. They could see that they accomplished these 5 things because they also were given those tasks, but they also knew that it wasn't going to make any difference. And so that's why I said, so many times I would have one of these commanders or sometimes squad members. I mean, all the way down to individual soldiers. If you would ask them a question, sometimes they're going to roll their eyes and go, yeah, well, you know how it really is. Because they knew that it wasn't changing anything. And look, you can also at the strategic level, you can look and you can see the violence levels. They don't ever go down. The number of districts at first, and then eventually the whole provinces that started going more and more into the Taliban area. Everything that you could actually measure was showing that the thing wasn't working. But because we can still point to these 5 things at each of the brigades that were there that were successful, everybody ignored the strategic stuff and just stuck with the things that were good. What commander wants to go in there and says, yes, during my 18 months as command of, RC East and as a division area there, things got worse and they're much worse today than they were with that. Good luck to you, and I'd like my 3rd star. That doesn't go anywhere. So no one reports that. They just report the things that were actually improved and ignore the things that weren't. The problem, for the country is that, when these things are on the media, and look, those stats were out there. I saw them. They weren't classified. They were open source, published all the time. That you don't have the media saying, hey, hang on, you keep saying it's getting better, but this violence is just going through the roof there. And people aren't supporting their government, and they aren't resisting the Taliban, which is what you said back in 2010 was the objective. And now here in 2017, 2018, whatever, it never changes, and in fact, it's much worse. So how do you guys keep saying this is a success? And no one ever asked those questions. They just repeated whatever the general or the colonel said, and they wrote it down. No one asked the hard questions. And so the American public never really understood that there was a problem because, well, as you know, the military doesn't lie. They only tell the truth. So they just blanket believed it without really, looking under the rock, so to speak, to see what was really going on. And then you have politicians, especially in these days, who don't have military experience of their own. So they don't know that these things aren't working right, or they don't have the experience that I do to know when what's being told to them doesn't make any sense. And they're afraid to challenge these people. And I'm talking about even at the presidential level. If you have a general telling them something, 3-4 star general, they're not going to challenge them when they didn't even serve as a private, And so those guys continue to perpetuate. Nobody asked the questions. And because, the casualty counts were manageable, they weren't that high for us. People just said, yeah, just let it keep going. Just keep throwing this, whatever it was, $3 or $4 billion a month into this. We can keep saying that we're helping women and children and all this kind of stuff and build more roads and schools. All that sounds great. The Western loves it. But the reality on the ground was never that way. And so the result that, finally happened in 2021 was predictable and just tragic and catastrophic.
So I know for people like you and others, and I've heard you talk, when you're with Matthew Hove and Danny Simpson and Scott Horton, when the Afghan papers broke, stuff you've been talking about for years, and if you've been paying attention, it wasn't surprising. But, for the general public, and, I read the Afghan papers book and, read a lot of the documents, it's a perfect sort of summary of what you said there, what they're getting on the ground level, they know that it's not going well, and they did all these interviews, and they say we have this problem, this problem, this problem, and we didn't have a plan. But then those very same people were on TV telling you how it went well. So, what did you think of the Afghan papers? Was it, just evidence of the whole time, but this time is actually being reported on? So what was your
So when I came out with my article there on the 5th of February of 2012, it just so happened that the ground commander, then Lieutenant General Curtis Scaparrotti, happened to be at the Pentagon that day. And so they had a Pentagon briefing. And so some of the reporters asking, they said, hey, what about this thing by Davis where he's saying all this stuff is going disaster and it's not working and, we could end up losing? What do you say about that? And Scaparrotti says, well, I saw it. I saw what he wrote. I mean, that's one person's opinion. I mean, he sees a little bit here and there. He doesn't see all the things that I see. And we're still very confident with our assessment and where we think things are going. And ultimately, that's just one person's opinion. Anyway, moving on. What's the next question? Yes, you in the back, and that's it. That's as far as it went there. And that's how it continued to go. So even in 2018, 6 years later, then here you have the Washington Post come out with this extensive level of information that just completely validated everything that I had been saying, but much more, provided a lot more evidence than I ever did. And what happened? Not a thing. Just crickets. People again ask questions here, and you get some mumbling answers, and then what's the next on the agenda? What's the next thing? What's the next political story we want to cover? They just forgot about it and left it, and the mission just kept going on without change. And that was really discouraging, because at first I thought, okay, now then that this has come out, and there was another guy, I think it was Dan Bolduc, I'm not completely sure, a retired general who came out and said, we lost the Afghan war and we were a mistake. After he got out of uniform, he came out and said that. And I thought, okay, now a general officer has said it. And again, absolutely nothing but crickets. Nobody, the retired general is kind of a tight knit club, and they just don't do that. And here's this one guy that did. And so he was kind of shunned and ignored. But then that's it. So everybody else was kept in line. Nobody else joined him. Nobody else, no other generals I'm talking about. Nobody supported that. And again, the media, it was a little boop, and then that's it going on. And when the same thing happened with the Washington Post papers, the Afghan papers, I was disappointed. I certainly wasn't shocked, because I'd seen it now for a decade. And so, again, nothing has changed. As you mentioned a second ago, you had a lot of the architects of that disaster who were asked at the time. And of course, they always find someone else to blame. I did good. This thing was right. And, this was good at the time, but, things change, whatever, just some kind of plausible denial, and people accept it and they just move on. And I think that because the American casualty rates were manageable and politically acceptable, then no one challenged it, no one pushed back. Because the other thing that helps keep these things perpetuated, which I just irks me to no end, is that we turned soldiers into caricatures, and that are perversely used to perpetuate these wars. Every time you see somebody in uniform, thank you for your service, I appreciate, yes, he's serving our country and making our country safe for democracy, and and keeping us safe at night, and all this. And I'm like, well, none of that is accurate in terms of Afghanistan and Iraq. We're not keeping ourselves safe here. We're not defending democracy. We're not doing any of those things. We're just continuing operations, because every time you go on a military operation, you can accomplish a tactical task against somebody who has no Air Force, no Navy, no drones, no, nothing but a bunch of homemade bombs. That's the only thing they've got, and a handful of machine guns. Of course, you can, with our military that has everything, we can accomplish any tactical task, but it has no strategic implication. And when only a certain number of soldiers die, and we deify all the, anyone who's wearing a uniform, and you go to any football game and you see, this guy's come out in uniform, and, like in baseball games, and everyone looking to the outfield seats, all these heroes of Americans, whatever, everybody stands up and claps, and they buy them dinner and all this stuff, meaning that everybody who's a veteran of these wars is a hero. So instead of saying, hey, why are we sacrificing pointlessly the lives of American servicemen? One life, or whether it was 400 in a year or one, just pointless, wasted. Instead of making American people being angry that a life was thrown into the trash for no reason, no benefit to the country, we clap and we say that guy, man, he died a national hero. God bless him. And the wars keep going on. And of course, that makes it easier to stay in wars because there's no pressure to pull anybody out. And that's the one of the most perverse things of this, is that the very people who pay the price for this nonsense are the very ones used as pawns to help perpetuate it.
So, from the sounds of it, it sounds like the system that's in place to continue the Iraq War and Afghanistan War is no one wants to stick their head out and say, I failed. There's squad rotations. It continues. Then there's the generals who go on TV and the media are happy to go along with it, saying it's a success. And congressmen and politicians again, they don't want to stick their head out. Is it careerism that really keeps things going? The ones, if after you're done in the military you want to sit on a board of an arms corporation, or you want to go to a think tank, and then from the public side, there's one, they're being lied to, propagandized, but they have, in America and probably Britain too, too much faith in the military, and as you said, that every soldier is a hero because they're keeping us safe, which again kind of plays into everything they've been told. So do you think that's the thing? It's a collection of things that keep the wheels turning, and these wars went on for 20 years and we're still in Iraq.
Well, there's no question about it, and the think tank world and the not just think tank, but some of these organizations, especially in Washington, that are well funded, and a lot of them have links back to some of the Defense Department. I'm not Defense Department, the military industrial complex, and they have funding from that. They want to, or even the defense contractors themselves. The Raytheons and the Boeings, et cetera. They facilitate this, what they call the rotating door of going from government into private sector. And so they have all these generals that come in there, and then they become their spokesmen, they become their board members, they go on. There's a whole industry of retired generals on all the different networks that go on there. And of course, people listen to them because the assumption is that they're just giving their personal military professional advice, but they, the vast majority of them have financial incentive to say something's going to make the person who's giving them their paycheck happy. And that has a perpetuating process, in that the guys who are active generals, they want that job. So they'll say the same things on here. So when they're interviewed, when they go and testify before Congress, they're going to say, oh yeah, man, we need more missiles, we need more tanks, we need more of this stuff. The budget's too small, whatever. So of course, all these defense contracting companies are going to just eat them up when they come out, because they're already telling the right story. And of course, most of this is not done consciously. Most generals don't say, okay, man, I'm going to say this at the hearing today so that I'll get a job tomorrow. It's just almost kind of built into the thing. It's subconscious, because you do want that job and what they want to hear. And of course, the compounding that further is that all of these defense contracting companies have enormous amounts, and tens of millions of dollars of they go in and lobby all the key congressmen, like the House Armed Services Committee, the Senate Armed Services Committee. There's no question, no surprise that you have massively more, 3 to 5 times more donated to their members than you do to the members of any other committee in Congress. And then you have them giving money in hundreds of millions of dollars to campaign finance, or to campaigns for those people that they support. So of course, if you're being lobbied by somebody, and if you're actually getting campaign contributions from somebody, you're subconsciously going to want to please them, even though it's rare, probably, maybe even never happen, that a company will say, hey, here's what I need you to say, member of Congress. Here's how I need you to vote, because we got this big contract coming up and I need to get it. So I need you to vote this way. They don't have to say that. All they have to do is give them campaign finance money, or send these experts with all their charts and showing how, retired colonels and generals themselves who are doing a lot of this lobbying and all this marketing stuff and videos that shows why this is helping America. So they're going to do all that stuff, and the problem is most of it's hogwash and nonsense, but it's an industry and it feeds on itself. And I honestly don't know how you get rid of that, how you break into that cycle, because I've been thinking about this for years and nothing has succeeded so far. What I fear is that the only way it's going to change is for there to be an absolute military disaster where we are crushed on a battlefield someday in a war we should never have fought. And that when we do fight, we're going to be a shell of what we think we are. And then we're going to get soundly defeated on a battlefield. And when there's a large scale casualties and it's not politically acceptable, then people start asking the hard questions and demanding hard answers. Then things can change. But that's kind of a bleak way to end this, I suppose. But that's what I fear we're heading towards, and I don't know any other way to fix this besides that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you just, I know you got to jump off, so you don't have to do. So, how do you think the military could be a good force? But if you don't have time, we can finish up. I know you got to jump off.
Yeah, I'll quickly. Yeah, there's only two ways to get this fixed. One is that we suffer a military disaster. We get sucked into a war we should never have fought, and we get, forgive the rudeness of it, we get our ass handed to us, and large numbers of casualties that should never have happened. But because we have not been honest with anyone, that's going to be the result. That's one way to get it fixed. The second way is you get some kind of once in a generation leader who does know these things and is willing to take the political heat and says, all right, forget this. We're not doing this trash anymore. Here's what we're going to do. Here's what makes sense. And you either get on board or you find yourself a new job. Something really firm and that is wisdom and a firm hand that knows what he's talking about and actually wants to strengthen the national defense and strengthen the military, but not throw it in the trash and not just make the pockets bigger of the defense contractors. One of those two things is the only way that will change. Otherwise, the system will continue on until one of those things happens.
Well, let's hope you're not. Hopefully, it's not the first one in a big war with Russia or China. Which we could talk a lot about, but I will let you go.
Yeah.
So if you want to tell people where to find you, you mentioned at the start. I put everything in the show notes, and I'll put it up on the screen.
Yeah.
But tell people, where to find yourself and your work.
Yeah, I publish everything that I write or all the videos that I have on my Twitter account, which is Daniel L. Davis and the number 1 at Daniel L. Davis 1. And if they want to follow me, they can go there.
Yeah, as I said, I'll put that in the show notes. I'll put it up on the screen. I really appreciate your time, but I know you got to jump off for your many interviews. So I'd like to thank you for coming on, and I hope you have a nice rest of the day.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.